Imagine walking into a restaurant you've always loved, only to be treated with disdain and prejudice by someone who doesn't even know your true story. That's exactly what happens to Mrs. Dorothy, an elderly woman who faces discrimination from a young waiter who, without knowing, judges her by the color of her skin. But what he doesn't realize is that Dorothy isn't just an ordinary customer. She's one of the restaurant's owners. This emotional story shows how prejudice can be faced with dignity and how the truth has the power to tear down any barrier. Stay until the end to see the incredible twist that will change everything. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. It was a typical autumn evening. The cold wind blew gently through the city streets, carrying with it dry leaves that scattered like scattered memories. Mrs. Dorothy was holding her granddaughter Sophia's little hand as they walked toward the restaurant that, for so long, had been a place of comfort for her. The warm lights coming from the establishment's windows seemed to promise a peaceful evening, a refuge from so many difficult experiences Dorothy had already faced. "The restaurant looks so beautiful at night, Grandma. I've never been here with you after dark," Sophia said, admiring the elegant glass doors. Dorothy smiled, recalling the many nights she had spent there with friends and family, celebrating achievements, finding comfort during times of loss. The restaurant had a special place in her life. It was more than just a place to eat. It was an extension of her own memories. "This place has always been special to me, dear. It's more than just a restaurant. It's a part of who we are," Dorothy replied, her eyes glistening with nostalgia. As soon as they walked in, the smell of freshly prepared food filled the air. The aroma of fresh bread and roasted herbs immediately brought a sense of familiarity. Dorothy took a deep breath, feeling at home. The atmosphere was refined but welcoming, with exposed brick walls and hanging lights that cast a soft glow over the dining room. However, as they approached the reception desk, something in the air seemed to change. A young waiter, looking as if he had just started the job, glanced at them with an impassive expression. He barely lifted his eyes from his reservation list, frowning as he saw Dorothy and her granddaughter. The once cozy atmosphere seemed to harden. "Good evening. I'd like to check our reservation," Dorothy said, her voice gentle but firm. The waiter, not even attempting to smile, glanced quickly at them and, without a hint of courtesy, retorted, "Are you sure you made a reservation for today?" His voice sounded disinterested, almost as if the question was rhetorical. Dorothy was momentarily surprised by the cold attitude. She knew this was a prestigious place, where the clientele was treated with attention and care. But at that moment, everything felt different. Keeping her composure, she replied, "Yes, we made a reservation. My name is Dorothy." The waiter didn't respond immediately. He flipped through the list indifferently, his thin fingers tapping the surface of the counter, as if this were a waste of time. After a few seconds, he shook his head and gave a small sigh of boredom. "Sorry, I don't see anything here. Maybe you got confused." Dorothy felt the icy air of indifference pierce her chest, but she remained dignified. "I'm certain I made the reservation. Could you please check again?" The waiter, with a mocking smile, finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and his tone became more pointed. "Look, ma'am, places like this are a bit exclusive. You understand what I mean? It's not the kind of place where you just show up without really being on the list." For a moment, Dorothy's heart tightened. She had heard that tone before, that venom disguised as false politeness. Her granddaughter, sensing the discomfort, squeezed her grandmother's hand more tightly. Dorothy, however, was not willing to accept humiliation without a fight. Her entire life had been marked by struggles, and she had always maintained her composure. Looking directly into the waiter's eyes, she calmly replied, "I understand perfectly well, but I'm asking you to check again, please." The waiter sighed again, this time more audibly, and reluctantly glanced at the list once more, pretending to search. His movements were slow and disdainful, as if he was only doing it out of obligation, not courtesy. "Nothing here, ma'am," he said finally, almost satisfied with himself. Sophia, not fully understanding what was happening, tugged at her grandmother's skirt and whispered quietly, "Grandma, why is he being so mean to us?" Dorothy, with a lump in her throat, looked down at her granddaughter and, trying to keep her calm, replied, "Some people, my love, don't know how to treat others with respect." Dorothy's response did not go unnoticed. The waiter rolled his eyes and, in a more acidic tone, added, "Maybe you should try another place, one that's more suitable." Dorothy kept her posture, though every word that left the young man's mouth felt like a blow. Racism was something she had faced countless times, but each new encounter with it brought back a feeling of indignation mixed with exhaustion. She took a deep breath, still controlling herself, and before she could say anything, a familiar voice echoed through the dining room. "Mrs. Dorothy, it's so good to see you again." Dorothy and the waiter turned at the same time to see the restaurant manager, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a genuine smile. He hurried over to her, clearly excited by her presence. Before we continue with this powerful story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. That's how you can contribute and help us keep bringing you meaningful stories about justice and overcoming challenges. Click the subscribe button now and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's continue. The manager, with his quick and confident stride, crossed the dining room as if he were reuniting with an old friend. The welcoming smile on his face contrasted sharply with the cold and disdainful attitude of the waiter. "Mrs. Dorothy, what a pleasure to see you again. How are things? And who is this young lady?" He looked at Sophia with curiosity. Dorothy smiled, feeling the tension in her shoulders ease a little. "This is my granddaughter, Sophia. We're here to have dinner and spend some time together." Sophia, shy, waved her hand and gave a slight smile. The manager crouched down to Sophia's height and said gently, "Welcome, Sophia. I hope you like the food here as much as your grandmother does." Dorothy watched the manager with gratitude, but before she could thank him, the waiter interrupted with a voice carrying the same contempt as before. She said she had a reservation, but I didn't find anything. Maybe she got confused. The manager stood up quickly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the waiter. The change in his expression was almost palpable. "Mrs. Dorothy always has a table here. It doesn't matter if she made a reservation or not," he stated with authority, his voice becoming firmer without losing its politeness. "You should know that." The waiter took a step back, visibly uncomfortable with the reprimand, but didn't completely lose his arrogant attitude. He glanced at Dorothy with thinly veiled disdain and shook his head as if he were suspicious of something. "Well, I didn't know we had this kind of special rule," he muttered quietly, trying to maintain his posture while the tension between him and the manager grew. Dorothy, who had remained calm up until that moment, finally reached her limit. She took a step forward, looking directly at the waiter. "Do you believe you can talk to me like that and get away with it? Or do you think I don't deserve the same respect you would give to anyone else who walks through these doors?" The dining room, which had been filled with murmurs and the sound of cutlery, seemed to come to a stop. Several heads turned, curious about the scene unfolding. The waiter, caught off guard by Dorothy's reaction, tried to mask his embarrassment. That's not what I meant," he stammered, his cheeks flushing slightly. "Then what did you mean?" Dorothy didn't let the question hang in the air. Her voice was calm, but sharp. Each word seemed to weigh more than the last. "Because what you said sounded very clear to me." Sophia, still holding her grandmother's hand, looked around, not fully understanding the depth of what was happening, but sensing the tension in the air. She squeezed Dorothy's hand tighter and asked, almost in a whisper, "Grandma, is everything okay?" Dorothy crouched down slightly, looking into her granddaughter's eyes. "Everything is fine, sweetheart. Sometimes people need to learn how to treat others with respect. And that's what we're teaching right now." The manager, clearly concerned with the rising tension, intervened, stepping closer to the waiter and speaking in a lower but firm tone. "I think it's best if you go to the kitchen and let me handle this." Now, the waiter looked at the manager with wide eyes. as if he was about to protest, but something in the manager's tone made him think twice. He huffed, gave Dorothy and her granddaughter one last look, and walked toward the kitchen, his frustration evident in every heavy step he took. Once he was out of sight, the manager turned to Dorothy with a look of sincere apology. "I'm so sorry about that, Mrs. Dorothy. That kind of behavior is unacceptable here, and I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Dorothy, though visibly hurt by the situation, smiled politely. "Thank you, but this kind of behavior still happens far too often. It's not just about me or today. It's about what this represents. I've been coming to this restaurant for a long time. I've always been treated with respect, and something like this shouldn't happen anywhere anymore." The manager nodded, clearly understanding what she was trying to say. "You're absolutely right. I'll talk to the staff to ensure this is taken seriously. Please, let me take you to the table you've always liked." He led Dorothy and Sophia to a table near the window, the place where Dorothy had always liked to sit. The soft light from the room reflected on the glass, creating a peaceful atmosphere. But the wound from what had just happened was still fresh. Dorothy pulled out a chair for Sophia, helping her settle in, and then sat down herself. The silence between them was heavy, and despite the manager's efforts to make amends, the hurt lingered. Sophia looked around, trying to understand why this place, which seemed so beautiful, had caused her grandmother so much pain. "Why was he so mean to you, Grandma?" Sophia finally asked, her voice carrying the innocence of someone who doesn't yet fully understand the world around her. Dorothy sighed, trying to find the right words. "Some people, sweetheart, think they can judge others by how they look. They look at someone and decide, without knowing them, who that person is or how they should be treated." Sophia frowned. "But that doesn't make any sense." "It doesn't indeed, but it's something that has been around for a long time. And that's why we need to be strong. Never let anyone make you feel like you're less than you are. Never." The waiter reappeared from the back of the restaurant, walking past the table, his eyes avoiding any eye contact. The manager kept him under watch, but the discomfort on the waiter's face was clear. He knew he had made a mistake, but his pride seemed to stop him from recognizing the severity of what he had done. Dorothy glanced at him briefly and, in silence, decided that words wouldn't be enough at that moment. Something bigger would have to be done, but she would wait for the right time. Sophia needed to eat, and despite what had happened, dinner had to go on. Dinner continued in an unusual manner. The waiter, now visibly uncomfortable, avoided passing by Dorothy and Sophia's table at all costs. He seemed to be trying to hide behind the other staff members, but his presence was noticed every time he came near the dining room, as if the tension was drawing him to the center of that discomfort. The manager, on the other hand, was doing his best to make up for the incident, frequently checking in at their table, offering the best service possible. "Is everything to your liking, Mrs. Dorothy?" he asked with a somewhat forced smile, his tone slightly anxious, as if trying to fix the unfixable. Dorothy nodded, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "The food is good as always. But, as you can imagine, it's not about the food." The manager lowered his gaze, fully aware that Dorothy's words carried a weight he couldn't resolve with simple courtesies. He stepped away, leaving behind a heavy silence. Sophia, who had been watching everything attentively, leaned toward her grandmother. "Grandma, is that waiter going to apologize?" Dorothy took a deep breath before responding. "I don't know, my dear. Sometimes people don't realize the harm they've done until someone teaches them a lesson." As they talked, the waiter passed by again, this time closer, though clearly trying to pretend he didn't see them. Dorothy watched him out of the corner of her eye, her mind working in silence. She knew confronting the situation right there and then wouldn't solve anything. However, what he had done couldn't simply be forgotten. A person's dignity couldn't be trampled on without consequences. Dinner continued amidst small moments of discomfort, where Dorothy tried to maintain a normal conversation with her granddaughter, but was constantly interrupted by the memory of the incident. The waiter, at some point, returned to the dining room to serve another nearby table. His behavior was noticeably different. He leaned in, smiled, and his voice was polite, almost fawning. The difference in treatment between that table and Dorothy's was striking. Sophia, with her childlike curiosity, noticed the contrast. "Why is he being so nice to them, Grandma? He didn't treat us like that." Dorothy looked at her granddaughter and felt the weight of the question. "Because, sweetheart, he thinks some people deserve more respect than others. He's wrong, but he believes that." The girl frowned, clearly confused. "But everyone deserves the same respect. Isn't that how it's supposed to be?" Dorothy nodded. "You're right, and that's something we always need to remember. But not everyone thinks that way. And some people believe they can judge others without even knowing them." The waiter, now closer, seemed to have overheard part of the conversation as he quickly glanced in Dorothy's direction, only to immediately look away, pretending to be focused on the other table's order. Dorothy didn't miss the moment, but she decided that the humiliation she had endured wouldn't be resolved with exchanged glances. She was waiting for the right moment to act. Meanwhile, the other customers in the restaurant began to notice the situation. Small whispers could be heard at some tables, and occasionally curious looks were cast in the direction of Dorothy and her granddaughter. The tension in the air was palpable, like a tightly stretched cord about to snap. Dorothy, always calm and dignified, maintained her composure, though the discomfort of being the target of stares didn't go unnoticed. "Why are people looking at us, Grandma?" Sophia asked, with the innocence of someone who still doesn't understand the world's cruelty. Dorothy gently held her granddaughter's hand and responded with the same calmness as always. "Because they're seeing something that shouldn't be happening. They know something is wrong." The manager approached once again, trying to ease the weight of the situation. "Can I offer you a complimentary dessert, Mrs. Dorothy? Maybe it will help make the evening a little more pleasant." Dorothy smiled kindly, but her eyes remained firm. "I appreciate the gesture, but a complimentary dessert doesn't erase what happened." The manager took a small step back, clearly unsure of what to do next. "I understand. I'll do my best to resolve this." As the manager stepped away, the waiter returned to the nearby table, continuing to serve with the same fawning attitude as before. The difference in treatment was more than evident, and now even the other customers noticed the discomfort in the air. Some murmured amongst themselves, while others exchanged discreet glances, as if trying to figure out what was really going on. Sophia, who had remained quiet for some time, finally asked, "Grandma, are you going to tell him he was rude to you?" Dorothy, with a calm smile, replied, "I will, dear, but not now. Sometimes you have to wait for the right moment to teach the right lesson." The evening was drawing to a close, and Dorothy knew that the revelation of what was about to come would completely change the dynamics of the dinner. The waiter, who continued to act as if nothing had happened, had no idea what he was about to face. Dorothy felt the curious stares of some of the customers, who, still not fully understanding what was happening, watched in silence. She knew that many there wouldn't see what she had experienced as anything significant. To them, it might have been just a service error, but to Dorothy it was something much deeper. It was a matter of respect, dignity, and most importantly, equality. She looked at Sophia, her innocent granddaughter, and felt the weight of the responsibility she carried. "I need to teach her that we must always fight for respect," she thought, "and that a person's dignity is non-negotiable." As the meal ended, the waiter passed by the table one last time, without saying a word. Dorothy, calm and serene, knew that the twist was near, and when it came, there would be no more room for excuses or averted gazes. The restaurant had quieted down. The crowd was thinning, with only a few occupied tables, and the hum of conversation had turned into a distant murmur. The soft ambient lighting remained, but to Dorothy, what once felt welcoming now seemed cold, almost hostile. As she finished her meal, thoughts raced through her mind, creating a clear path for what was to come. Sophia, sitting beside her, played with the folded napkin, trying to ignore the growing discomfort around them. "Grandma, are we still going to have dessert?" the girl asked innocently, as if trying to keep the mood light. Dorothy smiled, gently caressing her granddaughter's cheek. "Maybe next time, dear. I think we've had enough for today." The soft reply hid the whirlwind of emotions Dorothy was carrying. It wasn't just about the treatment she had received. It was about what it represented. Decades of prejudice and discrimination that persisted, even in spaces where she should feel safe. The dignity she maintained wasn't just a choice, but a means of survival. As they prepared to leave, the waiter returned to the dining room. He was holding an empty tray, but his eyes, which avoided directly meeting Dorothy's, betrayed his insecurity. The facade of superiority he had shown earlier was beginning to crumble. The manager, who had been watching from a distance, noticed the tense moment and approached, his expression a mix of professionalism and concern. "Mrs. Dorothy, please let me ensure everything is perfect until the very last minute. I truly apologize for what happened earlier." Dorothy kept her gaze steady on the manager. "Apologizing is one step, but resolving the issue is another. I've been coming here for years and never imagined I would face something like this here." The manager shifted uncomfortably, knowing there was no excuse sufficient for what had happened. "I completely understand, and I assure you this won't happen again. Our staff's behavior must always be exemplary." Before Dorothy could respond, the waiter, perhaps unable to bear the silence any longer, decided to chime in. "I was just following the rules. I didn't know who you were. If I had known, things would have been different." The words, which were meant to sound like a defense, only deepened the problem. Dorothy raised an eyebrow, and the tension around them increased. "And why would things have been different? Why do you need to know who I am to treat me with respect?" The waiter stammered, clearly caught off guard by the firmness of her question. Well, there are certain expectations here. I was just trying to do my job." Dorothy leaned slightly forward, her eyes locked on his. "Your job is to treat everyone with respect, regardless of who they are. That shouldn't change based on who you think deserves it." The dining room seemed to grow even quieter, as if every word from Dorothy was being absorbed by the atmosphere. The few remaining customers, realizing the gravity of the moment, glanced discreetly, as if witnessing something they knew was important. The manager tried to intervene again, his tone now more cautious. "He's right about one thing, Mrs. Dorothy. He didn't know. Not that it justifies the behavior, of course." Dorothy slowly shook her head, considering his words. "Knowing or not knowing who I am shouldn't make a difference. This place has a reputation to uphold, and what happened here today wasn't just a lapse in conduct. It was a reflection of something much bigger." The waiter, now visibly shaken, seemed unsure of what to do. The arrogance he had displayed earlier had disappeared, replaced by a mix of confusion and embarrassment. "I really am sorry. I didn't mean to offend." Sophia, who had been quietly observing, tugged on her grandmother's arm. "Grandma, why did he treat you like that? Didn't he know you're special?" Dorothy smiled softly at her granddaughter and answered serenely, "We're all special, sweetheart. But not everyone sees that." The manager, trying to ease the tension somehow, suggested, "Please, allow me to offer something to make up for this. Dinner is on the house. It's the least we can do to show our regret." Dorothy looked at the manager, but her firm expression made it clear she wasn't seeking material compensation. "This isn't about money or free dinners. It's about something much deeper. When people walk in here, they should be treated with dignity, and that didn't happen today." The manager nodded, unable to argue with what she was saying. The truth was undeniable, and the weight of the injustice was clear. I can only promise that we will work to ensure this never happens again." The waiter remained silent, unsure of how to redeem himself. The shame on his face was evident, but the words he needed to say still hadn't been found. Dorothy, however, didn't want this moment to be solely about reprimand. She had always believed that every difficult situation was also an opportunity for learning. "I believe everyone can learn from their mistakes, including you," she said, looking directly at the waiter. "I hope that, in the future, you think twice before judging someone by their appearance." He lowered his eyes, swallowing hard. "I will. I promise." Dorothy nodded, ending the conversation for now. The weight of the situation still hung in the air, but the dignity with which she handled it had left an impression on everyone present. As she rose from the table, she glanced around, feeling that the place, which had once been a refuge for her, had lost some of its warmth. "Let's go, dear," she said to Sophia, who was already ready to leave. As they walked out of the restaurant, the manager stood by the door, watching them with a mixture of respect and regret. The waiter, on the other hand, remained near the counter, deep in thought, perhaps reflecting on the impact of his actions. Dorothy didn't need to look back. She knew the message had been delivered. Dorothy and Sophia walked slowly along the sidewalk illuminated by the streetlights, the muffled sound of cars passing by in the distance. The cool night breeze gently caressed both their faces, as if trying to ease the weight of emotions lingering in the air after the scene at the restaurant. Dorothy, always elegant in her posture, looked ahead, her thoughts far away, while Sophia, holding her grandmother's hand, seemed still immersed in the questions circling her mind. "Grandma," Sophia began, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Why didn't you tell him who you really are? That you're the owner of that restaurant?" Dorothy stopped for a moment, looking down into her granddaughter's curious eyes. The smile that appeared on her lips was both tender and wise. "Because, dear, I don't need to use my power to demand respect. Respect should come because we're all human, not because I hold a title or position." Sophia furrowed her brow, still trying to fully understand. "But he was so mean to you. You could have told him, and he would have stopped." Dorothy nodded slowly, holding Sophia's small hand more firmly. "Yes, maybe he would have stopped. But he needs to learn to treat everyone well, not just those in power. That's what I'm trying to teach. We don't need to assert ourselves. We need people to see the value in each person without judgment." Sophia was silent for a moment, her wide eyes trying to absorb the lesson her grandmother was imparting. The path seemed longer now, with the sound of leaves rustling beneath their feet and the murmur of the city in the background. As they walked, Dorothy realized that something needed to be done. She knew the waiter wouldn't learn that lesson simply from what had happened that night. He needed to see the real consequences of his actions, but in a way that wasn't just a punishment. He needed to understand the depth of his mistake. The next day, Dorothy made a decision. She made a brief but firm phone call to the restaurant manager. Her tone was calm, but there was a determination in her voice that left no room for doubt. "I would like to schedule a meeting with the staff. We need to discuss what happened last night, and I'd like the waiter to be present," she said without hesitation. The manager on the other end of the line tried to reassure her. "Mrs. Dorothy, I assure you we're taking the necessary steps. We've already spoken to him, and—" Dorothy gently interrupted. "I know you're doing what you believe is right, but I think this is a learning opportunity for everyone. I'll be there tomorrow at 10 a.m. The manager agreed, clearly aware that when Dorothy made a decision, she didn't change her mind easily. The next day, Dorothy arrived at the restaurant with Sophia by her side. The atmosphere felt different in the daylight, less welcoming than usual, as if the walls of the place carried the weight of the previous night. The manager greeted her at the door, trying to appear confident, but his unease was visible. "Mrs. Dorothy, please come this way. I've prepared the meeting room," he said, leading her to a private area in the back of the restaurant. Dorothy entered the room with Sophia by her side. At the back, a few staff members were already gathered, including the waiter who had disrespected her. He was standing with his arms crossed, clearly uncomfortable. His eyes quickly avoided Dorothy's gaze when she entered, and he shifted in his seat, unsure of what to expect. The silence in the room was heavy. The manager, visibly nervous, broke the ice. "Well, as everyone knows, Mrs. Dorothy is one of the founders of this restaurant. She has a long and respected history here, and last night, something happened that doesn't represent the values of this place." The waiter, hearing these words, seemed to freeze. His eyes finally lifted to meet Dorothy's, a mixture of shock and embarrassment written across his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Dorothy stepped forward, her gaze steady but not aggressive. "Yes, I am one of the owners of this place. But that's not the most important thing. What really matters is that every person who walks through these doors should be treated with respect. This isn't about who I am, but about who we all are." The waiter, now pale, finally spoke. I didn't know. If I had known." Dorothy raised her hand, stopping him. "That's exactly what I'm trying to say. You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with respect. That's the point." The room fell silent again. The other staff members watched the scene, clearly surprised by the turn of events. Dorothy's calm, dignified demeanor made it clear she wasn't there to demand respect for her position, but to teach a much larger lesson. Sophia, sitting next to her grandmother, looked at the waiter with curious eyes. She didn't fully understand the power dynamics at play, but she knew this moment was important. The manager, trying to regain some control of the situation, suggested, Perhaps this is a good time to discuss how we can improve our service moving forward, so that everyone feels welcome, no matter who they are." Dorothy nodded. "Exactly. That should be the focus from now on. I want everyone to know that this restaurant was founded on principles of inclusion and respect. And that's what I expect to see here every day." The waiter, now flushed, slowly nodded. "I understand. I was wrong. And I'm sorry." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment, her words hanging in the air. "I hope you've learned something from this. Not just about me, but about the value of every person who walks through these doors." With that, the meeting began to wind down. Dorothy knew that the impact of her words would take time to sink in, but she also knew that it was necessary to let the moment leave its own mark. As she and Sophia left the restaurant, the morning sun shone brightly, as if washing away the shadows of the previous day. Dorothy took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace. She had done the right thing, and now it was time to move forward. Dorothy and Sophia walked toward the restaurant's exit under the watchful eyes of the staff, who were still trying to process the magnitude of the lesson they had just witnessed. The air outside was cooler, and the silence between grandmother and granddaughter was heavy with meaning. Dorothy knew the episode wouldn't end so easily. The waiter, though he had apologized, would need time to truly reflect on the impact of his actions. However, Dorothy also knew that change wouldn't come with just an apology. Something deeper was needed, and for her this journey was only beginning. The next day, as Dorothy was reviewing her company's documents at home, her phone rang. The voice of the restaurant manager, now much more formal and tense than at their previous meeting, surprised her. "Mrs. Dorothy, I need to inform you of a problem that arose after our meeting." The waiter, he resigned. Dorothy paused for a moment, absorbing the manager's words. Resigned? Why? There was a disagreement between him and the other staff. It seems some of them believe he was treated too harshly and are defending him. The situation became delicate, and he decided to leave. Dorothy's heart sank for a moment. She knew that confronting racism and discrimination often met with resistance, especially from people who didn't understand the depth of the problem. She quickly considered the possible repercussions of this. And the other staff? How are they reacting? Dorothy asked, already anticipating the answer. The atmosphere is tense, Mrs. Dorothy. Some believe what happened was blown out of proportion, that he was simply misunderstood. I'm trying to mediate the situation, but I thought you'd want to know. Dorothy took a deep breath, feeling the weight of persistent injustice. Thank you for informing me. I'll think about how to handle this. As she hung up the phone, Dorothy realized she was facing a bigger obstacle than just the prejudice of one waiter. There was a quiet resistance, a refusal to acknowledge that the situation went deeper than a simple mistake. She knew that if she wanted to bring about real change, she would have to confront this resistance head-on. That night, Dorothy reflected deeply on what had happened. The dilemma was now clear. Even when trying to correct an injustice, there were those who, out of ignorance or fear, clung to old prejudices. She needed a new strategy. The next day, Dorothy decided to return to the restaurant. This time, without Sophia. She wanted to handle the situation directly, without exposing her granddaughter to another potentially tense discussion. Upon arrival, she was greeted by the same manager, whose expression now showed more concern. "Mrs. Dorothy, I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Is everything okay?" he asked, trying to hide his unease. Dorothy nodded, but her steady gaze conveyed a clear message. "I need to speak with the staff again. We need to settle this once and for all." The manager, hesitant, led her to the same meeting room where a few staff members were already gathered. The atmosphere was visibly more tense than last time. Some faces revealed discomfort, while others seemed to support the waiter who had left. Dorothy sat down in front of them, folding her hands on the table. The silence was almost palpable, and she felt the weight of their eyes on her. "I know there's been a lot of discussion since we last met," she began, her voice calm and serene. "And I know many of you don't agree with what happened." Some of the staff exchanged glances, but no one spoke up. "I'm not here to force anyone to think a certain way," Dorothy continued. "But I want everyone to understand one thing. Respect and dignity are not optional. They should not be granted only to those you think deserve them. Everyone deserves respect, regardless of their appearance, skin color, or status." A young employee, sitting at the end of the table, finally broke the silence. "But, Mrs. Dorothy, what he did wasn't that bad. He was just confused. Maybe if he had a second chance." Dorothy looked directly at the young woman, her expression gentle but firm. "I understand that you may feel sympathy for him, but this isn't about giving someone a second chance for a mistake. It's about understanding that his mistake was a reflection of something much bigger. He judged someone without even trying to know them. And that is the problem." The manager, who had remained silent until then, decided to intervene. "Mrs. Dorothy is right. The behavior we saw is not acceptable. And if we want to maintain the standards of respect and inclusion this restaurant has always upheld, we need to make changes." An older man sitting at the back of the room leaned forward, looking uncomfortable. "Changes, yes, but maybe we're going too far. We can't punish someone so harshly for a mistake." Dorothy looked at him with a firm but not hostile gaze. "The problem isn't just the mistake. It's what it represents. And if we don't correct this mentality, more mistakes like this will happen." Silence returned to the room, but now there was a growing understanding. The faces of the staff showed that Dorothy's message was beginning to sink in. This wasn't about one single incident. It was about a culture that needed to be challenged. At the end of the meeting, the manager thanked Dorothy for her patience and the firmness with which she handled the situation. "I know this isn't easy, Mrs. Dorothy, but I think we're starting to understand what needs to be done." Dorothy smiled slightly, her mind still processing everything that had happened. Change is never easy, but it's necessary. As she left the restaurant for the second time, Dorothy felt a mixture of exhaustion and hope. The road ahead was long, but she knew she had planted a seed. Now it was a matter of waiting to see how it would grow. The sound of cutlery echoed softly through the nearly empty restaurant. Dorothy was seated at her usual table near the window. The soft light of the evening filtered through the glass, reflecting off her teacup, casting small golden beams that danced across her hand. Outwardly, her posture remained firm and unwavering, but inside, she was preparing for what was to come. She had requested a final meeting with the manager and a few key staff members, including those involved in the recent crisis. There was something that still needed to be resolved, something bigger than the waiter's resignation. Dorothy felt that the issue required more than just a superficial conversation. It needed deep, meaningful change, and this meeting would be decisive. The manager arrived first, as always punctual, but with a noticeably more tense demeanor. He knew that the conflict hadn't been fully resolved and that Dorothy, with her firm stance, was there to ensure that real changes were made. Mrs. Dorothy, he began, with a forced smile that failed to mask his concern. Thank you for giving us another opportunity to discuss the next steps. Dorothy nodded, wasting no time on pleasantries. I appreciate your readiness, but we're past thank yous. We need concrete actions. The manager sat down in front of her, nervous, his eyes betraying the anxiety his voice was trying to conceal. Yes, of course. I agree. Some adjustments have already been made, but there's still resistance. At that moment, the door to the dining room opened, and 3 staff members entered. Among them, to Dorothy's surprise, was the waiter who had caused the initial incident. He avoided eye contact, keeping his gaze fixed on the floor as the other 2 sat beside him, visibly uncomfortable. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier. Dorothy, though somewhat expecting this, knew that his presence here changed the tone of the meeting entirely. It seems we have an unexpected guest, Dorothy said, her voice calm but with a hint of tension. I didn't expect to see you again. The waiter, now paler than ever, finally lifted his eyes to meet Dorothy's. I asked to be here. I wanted to speak with you directly. The silence in the room was almost deafening. All eyes turned to Dorothy, waiting for her reaction. She, however, remained composed, though she could feel the curiosity rising in the others. And what would you like to say? Dorothy asked, with a calmness that belied the intensity of the moment. The waiter took a deep breath, clearly struggling to find the words. I was wrong, and I know my mistake was bigger than I realized at the time. It wasn't just about how I treated you, it was about how I see people. Dorothy kept her gaze fixed on him, listening intently. Her hands rested on the table, fingers intertwined in a gesture of patience. When you walked in that day, the waiter continued, I didn't see a customer. I saw someone I thought didn't belong there, and that was wrong. I judged you, and apologizing isn't enough. I understand that now. The other staff members watched the scene unfold, some with expressions of surprise, others with a mix of sympathy and discomfort. The manager remained silent, observing how the situation played out. Dorothy, after a few moments of silence, finally spoke. You're right. Apologizing isn't enough, but recognizing where you went wrong is the first step. And for many people, that's the hardest step. The waiter nodded, visibly relieved to have expressed what he'd been holding inside. I'd like another chance to show that I've learned. I know it's a lot to ask, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Dorothy remained silent for a moment, contemplating the waiter's words. She knew that racism wasn't something corrected by an apology or a second chance. It was a change in mindset, something that required continuous effort. If I give you this second chance, you'll have to prove that you've truly changed. Not just to me, but to everyone you serve. Because the respect you failed to show me, you owe to everyone. The waiter nodded vigorously. I understand, and I'm willing to do that. Dorothy looked over at the manager, who seemed to be waiting for her decision. What do you think? She asked, giving him the opportunity to weigh in. The manager, hesitant, chose his words carefully. I believe everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow, Mrs. Dorothy. And if he's willing to make that effort, it might be worth considering. Dorothy pondered the manager's words. She knew that while justice was important, the opportunity for redemption should also be offered, especially when the person showed sincerity. Very well, Dorothy said finally. You'll have your second chance, but know that I'll be watching, and I expect your actions from here on out to reflect the words you've said today. The waiter, clearly emotional, thanked her repeatedly, his voice trembling with relief. Thank you, Mrs. Dorothy. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. The tension in the room began to dissipate, but there was still an air of uncertainty. The other staff members, who had remained silent until now, seemed to be processing the turn of events. They knew that Dorothy's attitude was one of forgiveness, but also of vigilance. As everyone prepared to leave, The waiter approached Dorothy one last time. "I just want you to know that what happened made me see the world differently, and I'm truly committed to changing." Dorothy looked him directly in the eyes, her expression gentle but serious. "I hope so, because there's no place for the attitude you displayed, here or anywhere else." With that, she stood up, straightening her posture, and made her way to the door. The weight of the meeting was undeniable, but Dorothy knew she had done what was right. She had given him a chance, but with the clear expectation that he would honor his words. As she walked out of the restaurant, the sun had already set, and the night was beginning to envelop the city. Dorothy took a deep breath, feeling a lightness she hadn't felt in days. The fight against prejudice and discrimination was ongoing, but every small victory counted. She looked up at the darkening sky and with a serene smile, whispered to herself, "One step at a time." The next morning brought a new day to the restaurant. The sun filtered through the large windows, illuminating the empty dining room where the tables waited for the evening's customers. As promised, Dorothy was back. She wanted to see how the changes she had suggested were unfolding, and to ensure that the waiter's promises weren't just empty words. Upon entering, she was greeted by a different atmosphere. The restaurant felt more serene, the environment more welcoming, as if even the walls were eager to offer a new experience. The manager, as attentive as ever, was there to greet her, but this time with a calmer demeanor. "Good morning, Mrs. Dorothy," he said with a genuine smile. "We're ready to welcome you again." Dorothy smiled slightly, but there was a seriousness in her eyes. "I'm here to make sure everything is as it should be." This time, she chose a central table, different from her usual spot by the window. She wanted to be at the heart of the restaurant, observing the dynamics. A few minutes later, the waiter appeared, holding a menu in his hands. His demeanor was completely different. He seemed humble, his movements more measured, as if he were mindful of every gesture. "Good morning, Mrs. Dorothy," he said in a soft voice. "Would you like to start with your usual tea?" Dorothy looked at him, her eyes studying every detail of his posture. "Yes, please," she responded calmly. While watching his expression, he quickly took the order and left to prepare the tea. There was a clear difference in his behavior, and Dorothy could sense that something had indeed changed. But she knew that the real test would come with time. A change in attitude could only be validated through consistent actions. As she waited, more customers began to arrive at the restaurant. She watched the other staff members, noticing the extra effort to ensure that every customer was treated well. Conversations around her flowed naturally, and there was a lightness in the air that hadn't been present during her previous visits. When the waiter returned with the tea, he placed the cup in front of Dorothy carefully, maintaining a respectful and attentive gaze. "If you need anything else, I'm at your service." Dorothy nodded, watching him walk away. He had taken a big step by apologizing, but she knew that only time would confirm his transformation. As she sipped her tea, a family entered the restaurant, a couple with a young daughter. They were visibly excited, and the manager greeted them enthusiastically, guiding them to a table near Dorothy. The little girl, cheerful and full of energy, played with the silverware while her parents talked. Dorothy watched the scene with a quiet smile. She remembered the days when she would take Sophia out to dinner, and how every small interaction mattered in building positive memories. This was exactly what she wanted for everyone who walked through those doors. Then, the waiter returned to serve the new family. He approached with the same calm and careful demeanor, treating them with the same courtesy he had shown Dorothy. When he saw the little girl playing, he smiled and offered a small, kind gesture, a paper flower he had folded while waiting in the kitchen. "This is for you," he said, handing the flower to the girl, who smiled with delight. The parents thanked him, visibly impressed by the simple but thoughtful gesture. Dorothy watched everything closely, and for a moment, she felt that the effort was starting to pay off. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic reparations, but about small changes that, in the end, created an environment of respect and inclusion. After a while, the manager approached Dorothy, eager to hear her thoughts. "How are things today, Mrs. Dorothy?" She took one last sip of her tea before responding. "Things are better. But remember, what matters is maintaining this consistency. Good service shouldn't be a one-time event." The manager nodded, aware of the truth in her words. "You're right. We're committed to ensuring that everyone here continues to uphold this standard." Dorothy stood up, ready to leave, but before departing, she called the waiter over. He came promptly, without hesitation, now with more confidence. "You did a good job today," she said with a slight smile. The waiter was visibly moved, but maintained his composure. "Thank you, Mrs. Dorothy. It means a lot to hear that from you." She placed her hand gently on his shoulder in a gesture of approval. "True change happens within. Don't stop striving for that change." He nodded, his eyes full of gratitude. "I won't. I promise." With that, Dorothy walked toward the door, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. There was still a long way to go, but at least in that place, in that small battle, she had planted the seeds of change. As she stepped out into the daylight, she took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air on her face. The world still carried many injustices, but every small step toward change mattered. She knew that as long as people continued to fight for what was right, the world could gradually become a fairer place. Dorothy's story teaches us a powerful lesson. Respect should not only be given to those who seem deserving in the eyes of others. Everyone deserves dignity, regardless of their appearance, status, or any other superficial characteristic. But more than that, this story reminds us that even those who make mistakes can change, if they have the humility to recognize their errors and commit to transformation. The waiter, initially arrogant, learned this lesson the hard way, and it is this change we hope to see in the world. Remember, every act of respect can be a step toward a more just and equal future. If you also believe that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, don't forget to leave your comment and share your thoughts. And of course, subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories.